Hi, folks. Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational Next Economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Deborah, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
So let's start maybe with your background. Where do you consider home and why?
Well, I think I'm one of the few people left who lives in the place I was born. So I grew up just outside of Boston, and the area that I'm working in is where my brothers were born. And I live in Jamaica Plain, which is a part of the city that has an unusually progressive profile, very diverse socioeconomically, racially, et cetera. And so this is deeply, deeply home, but it's a home I came back to. I never thought I would end up staying here, and I really left and spent a good portion of my time away from Boston and then returned to it for graduate school. Again, didn't think I'd stay. And really, I would say I landed back here 5 years ago when I decided to really plant roots.
Very cool. So maybe it's a misperception of people who don't live in Boston, but you don't have the accent. Is that maybe it comes out with friends?
No, if you hear that accent, you wouldn't want to have it either. I think it's one of the least attractive accents out there. So it's an option. You can have it or not have it.
I love it. So when you were growing up, were there any teachers or experiences that profoundly impacted you and helped guide you to your current career path?
You know, I actually think it's really deeply in my family. I have an interesting history in my dad's side of the family where 4 generations ago, my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother came over from Eastern Europe when they were escaping anti-Semitism. And the men in that line of the family all became entrepreneurs, and the women all became rabble-rousers. So my great-grandmother, Sarah Gordon, who was just a poor immigrant, was sort of very loud-mouthed communist. And she was actually even named by McCarthy as a communist, but she was just an organizer. And my Aunt Judy, my dad's sister, was a freedom rider in Mississippi. And I had this double lineage coming at me, which I think put me right where I am, of entrepreneurs who are figuring out how to create initiatives that do address capital, and rabble-rousing activists that are questioning the distribution of capital. And that kind of landed me right where I am today.
Yeah, and maybe for folks who don't know, what are you up to currently?
So I have sort of 2 main initiatives I'm involved in, but the one that I'm talking about primarily today is the Boston Impact Initiative, which is a place-based impact investing fund with a focus on economic justice. So what that means is we use integrated capital, equity, debt, and grant making, and every hybrid capital instrument in between, to invest in enterprises in Eastern Massachusetts that ideally are owned by communities of color, serving communities of color, and addressing the wealth disparities that we have in our community. And the intent of that work is really to challenge some of our assumptions about the way finance and capital work, and who can be an entrepreneur and who can build wealth. We're trying to address the pervasive discrepancy and disparity in where wealth lives in our culture.
Yeah, so Boston Impact Initiative, and there's a particular program, I think is this Ujima project? Is that
similar, or is that a project of the Boston Impact Initiative, or is that something separate?
Yeah, well, so Boston Impact Initiative is one of many organizations that are stewarding the Boston Ujima project. So I have a systems thinking background, and a lot of my work is about breaking down silos. We have a corporate culture of reductionism, right? Each company deals with a different issue. Same thing in the philanthropic sector, which is each organization is dealing with a particular problem, when in fact we're dealing with highly complex interdependent problems. And so we need highly complex interdependent solutions to that. So Boston Impact Initiative, along with the Center for Economic Democracy, City Life Vita Urbana, the NAACP, there's a number of organizations that have woven together very tightly to create this neighborhood-based alternative economic system called the Boston Ujima Project.
That sounds exciting. So what is it, and what are some of the things it's done so far?
So first, I should say it's really early on. We are just getting started and really figuring out how to get it launched. And I think, we've been talking about it a lot because people get so excited about the project that they end up thinking that it's further along than it is. But we're trying to say, what would it look like to have a democratically controlled economy? So low-income people in the neighborhoods that we're talking about, the parts of Boston we're looking at are Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and Jamaica Plain, and saying that actually the people who live there are the ones who know what they need in their communities. They know what kinds of businesses and services they need. They know which types of businesses they like and want to support and the ones they wish weren't there, right? So for example, they might say, we want a bike shop here, but we don't want check cashing here. Or we want a food co-op here, but we don't want Walmart to come in here. And so we put the people at the center of the economic system who, through a process of democratic decision-making as well as participatory budgeting, start to identify what they need in their community. That then connects into a business alliance of what we call good businesses, which we mean would be a community-driven set of standards that people say, what a good business is in Dorchester is one that pays a $15 minimum wage, or what a good business is in Dorchester is one that aspires to zero waste. Those good businesses become eligible for a community-controlled capital fund where ordinary folks, non-accredited investors can put capital into the fund, backed by a philanthropic loan loss reserve to protect them from losing their money, and supported by a patient capital pool, money from perhaps accredited investors that are willing to tolerate more risk in not being backed by the loan loss reserve. Only good businesses be eligible for that, and every person who joins the community capital fund gets one vote. It doesn't matter how much money you put in. So it becomes a democratic process of allocating capital to good businesses. And then those businesses, once you're an investor in it, you've identified it as a citizen saying, I want a bike shop here. You've invested in it as a citizen. Those businesses are going to be far more likely to succeed, right? They have this sort of ecosystem of relationships that they're in. And the last piece of the Ujima project, of course, ties into anchor institutions in government. I actually just came this morning from meeting with a religious institution that's saying, how can I change my procurement practices so that I'm buying from Black and Brown owned businesses, right? So how do we build in the hospitals, the universities, religious institutions, and government as part of the ecosystem that supports this neighborhood-driven economy? It's highly ambitious.
I love it. Do you already have an existing pool of capital when you first come to a community that you're looking to work with? Or does it start from square zero? Like the community itself is the one that raises the investment capital?
Yeah, I mean, so this is really specific. This is this place that we're talking about. And so in the stage that we're in, we've only done a pilot where we raised capital from the community. 5 businesses from the community pitched. The community allocated that capital. And we demonstrated that the process works. So the next stage is to raise a much bigger fund. That was just $20,000 that we allocated, and the businesses were pitching for small amounts. The next stage will be to raise a $150,000 fund, and from there, we'll go to a much larger fund. It's so place-based. It's coming from the organizations and the people on the ground. In fact, what's to me so exciting about the Boston Ujima project is that what's at the center of the project are the grassroots member-based organizations and the people, right? It's the people who are gathering folks around foreclosure and eviction blockades. It's the members of the NAACP, right? It's the groups that have done advocacy and policy work to support equity in these communities. It's the civic and faith-based groups. It's the labor groups. So all of the organizations that represent the people are the ones at the center, which is why it's a long arc to build this. Otherwise, people from the outside come in and tell a community what they want. So when we put the grassroots at the center and they organize members to show up and start to name what they want, from there you can then build up the fund. And I'll say there's really very little shortage of capital to do this kind of thing. There's a lot of impact capital that wants an opportunity to invest in ways that are really authentically doing good and led by community. There's too much impact capital going to places that actually still has extractive finance at the center. So I don't think the raising the capital is going to be a challenge at all. I think it's going to be really the hard, slow work of organizing people. And that's what's really strong about Ujima, is that the organizing work is at the center and is going really well.
How does it work with folks who probably don't have much investing experience? And how do you help them, or how do they decide what is a good investment or not?
So again, I would say that a lot of this is still unfolding, right? It's a very emergent process. But when we did the summit where we had that $20,000 and had a chance to allocate that, those of us like myself from Boston Impact Initiative and others who work more on the capital side helped prepare the business's pitch. So this is where the technical assistants come in. It's a big part of the Ujima ecosystem is the role of all of the technical assistance providers, whether they're supporting co-op development or financial literacy or marketing, whatever it may be. There's preparing those small businesses from the neighborhood to be ready to take investment. That's one part. In terms of vetting the investments, I think that when we have the bigger fund, the intention is going to be to hire one person who's really doing the due diligence and doing it on behalf of the community. But how that gets structured is still to be determined.
Great. And what percentage of your time is spent on, say, Ujima versus other initiatives within maybe Boston Impact Initiative? And I think you mentioned you were involved in another one as well.
Yes. Yeah. So the majority of my time is actually running Boston Impact Initiative, which is our own fund. So I look at it this way: we're trying to put capital into the hands of businesses that have been left out of capital. And when I look for places to invest that meet the kind of sort of regenerative practices, equitable ownership, sort of democratic participation, there are not a lot of investment-ready businesses. And I'm restricted geographically to Eastern Massachusetts. So when I look for that criteria, there's more capital available than there are investment-ready businesses, which means that we've had to put our attention on building the field, right? If we look at, let me give you an example of what I mean. So in the city of Boston, it's really helpful to make this concrete, right? The median net worth of a white family in Boston is $247,000. That's total assets minus total debt. The median net worth of a Black family in Boston is $8. Right? It's sort of like a shocking number when you let that land. Right? So imagine you're a Black entrepreneur and you want to get your enterprise off the ground and you have no credit history, no personal savings, right? We usually bootstrap. That's how we entrepreneurs get things going. You can't rely on friends and family. You can't rely on your alumni network, and the social capital isn't there to get it going. So to address that problem, we have to change the structure of how our opportunity for entrepreneurship works in this city. And that's why we do the field building work. And so the field building work is everything for us from building the knowledge around worker cooperatives, how to use direct public offerings to raise capital, building the capacity of grassroots nonprofits to understand their role in economic development and in starting their own businesses where they own and control the asset base. And then, of course, the Boston Ujima project takes it all the way to envisioning what an entirely alternative economic organizing system is, right? I would say probably half of my time, of my Boston Impact Initiative time, is spent working on our fund, which is actually finding and investing in enterprises here. And the other half is on building the field. And some of that field building is the types of initiatives I just mentioned. And a lot of it is actually leaving the city and going to other places. I get a lot of invitations from community foundations and other impact investors to say, wait a minute, what does it look like to put economic and racial justice at the center of our impact investing activity? That is not the norm right now in impact investing. And in fact, it's a huge blind spot for impact investors, which means the question of who owns this enterprise? How does that ownership redistribute wealth? Or does it perpetuate the racial wealth disparity, right? Who's getting employed in this enterprise? What is the job quality that's getting created? Is there any opportunity for worker ownership? You can go on and on and on to look at that, but we've got to really rethink as impact investors what we're actually supporting, what we're perpetuating, and what we're disrupting. So that's where I'm spending a lot of my time. The other place is I started something at the same time as Boston Impact Initiative called the Old Oak Dojo. This is a whole other territory that we could explore or not. But this is for me, when I look at the Boston Impact Initiative, as much as I hope that we're pioneering a different way of thinking about the allocation of capital, we're still working inside of a capitalist system where wealth that's been accumulated is being redeployed. It's not entirely envisioning an alternative. And so the Old Oak Dojo is a urban learning center that operates entirely in gift culture, which is what does it mean to not transact in any way around our resources. So it's an event center, it's a gathering space, it's a retreat space for anybody working on racial, social, economic justice. And it's an entire experiment in paying it forward and allowing our resources and our gifts to flow instead of getting hoarded and accumulated and stored as they do in capitalism.
Wow. I must say, I've never spoken to someone who is so dead on bullseye as to what we're trying to do at Lift Economy. So it's just so nice to talk to you, Deborah.
That's great.
I love this. I mean, I would love to get into the Old Oak Dojo, but maybe like to just sort of say a few more things on the Boston Impact Initiative, especially the idea of there's more capital than there are investment-ready businesses. What sort of returns are you looking for your fund? Is it, because I think one of the things that we've noticed is, there's the idea, not Boston Impact Initiative is not like this, but other impact investors, we've noticed like, oh, we're impact investors, but we still want to have, an IPO, or we still want to have, a bunch of exits from our investment positions, which is, you're creating impact. Maybe it's better than, say, maybe a natural products company is better than a traditional poison product that's high growth, but the beneficiaries on the capital side are limited partners who already have a lot of money. And so we're trying to look at how do you actually have some returns, but the returns are modest, so it's not as extractive for the entrepreneur. I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that.
I have so much to say about that topic, and I get myself in trouble a lot around my opinions on that. So let me go back to what I said earlier about being a systems thinker. And so I like to look at the world as modeled on nature, right? Which is like we have a lot to learn from nature. And if we look at natural systems, accumulation in nature is stagnation, right? So when resources accumulate in one area, that's actually not a sign of good health in natural systems. And I often like to compare. So if we go back to my stats, right, about $247,000 for a white family, $8 for a black family. And imagine that Boston is, if we look at natural systems, imagine that Boston's like a human body. Well, basically what we have is accumulation in one part of the body at the expense of another. We also have what's in a human body, when we have unregulated growth in one area of the body at the expense of the rest of the body, that's called cancer, right? So a healthy human body circulates resources to all of itself, especially where they're most needed. So now if you go to the conversation, I'm going to make this big leap to market rate returns. Market rate returns means that where the wealth is accumulated, it's being perpetuated. And it has to move from where it's accumulated to where it's been extracted from, if you buy my argument about healthy living systems, which means we need to be looking at concessionary returns without any question. And if we're impact investors that really care about justice and equity. So for me, the conversation about concessionary returns gets really tricky. Anytime you talk to most of the impact investors I talk to get all excited about how they're able to demonstrate that you can get market rate returns by doing impact. I'm like, of course you can. Absolutely. You can find women-owned businesses, you can find Black-owned businesses, you can find brown-owned businesses that do great work and are going to get you market rate or better returns. Of course you can find them, but that's not the point to me. The point is to start to move the capital, not from the outlying high flyers, like we'll all find those, but to ordinary folks in those communities where we doubt that we could ever make those investments. And the example that I like to use is a group here that's been one of my first investments in my portfolio, and we've been in with them through 3 rounds, which is called Thero Cooperative. It's a worker-owned organic waste recycling cooperative that was founded by 2 grassroots groups, one from the Black organizing group that did a lot of work around criminal justice, and one from a Latino organizing group. And these groups sort of got fatigued of doing advocacy and policy work and not seeing anything change. And they came together and they formed this worker-owned cooperative. It's now got 7 people in it. Every worker owner has a working class or low income background. Half of the workers are women. Half have been homeless. Half have a criminal record, and a quarter lack high school degrees. And yet every single worker owner has a vote, and every worker owner makes $20 an hour. Now, that's not where you're going to go find your market rate returns. That's where our first loan to them was at 0%. They did a crowdfunding campaign. They did an Indiegogo campaign to raise enough money to file for a direct public offering. And then they went door to door with low-income people that they knew, and they managed to raise $340,000 from their community. And we were able to do another round with a floating return ranging from 3 to 5%. And it's still a haul for them to get there. But that's moving wealth, not just income. It's not delivering philanthropic services or economic development to poor communities. The only way we're going to change this is through the transfer of wealth, because we know assets beget more assets. And so if the goal, as it is for me, is to move the ownership and control of assets to low-income folks, we really have to think differently about our returns. And so in answer to your question, we are going to be structured. So we currently have been running our fund with our own capital as a pilot phase, but we're going to be a charitable loan fund that will sell notes at different levels, and it will probably be in the 2 to 4% range. And some of the investments we'll make that we think are likely to return more, we may use to subsidize some of the higher risk investments that no one would say yes to, but we know are necessary.
Yeah, that's I remember someone told me that the forest grows at a rate of 4% per year, so it's like a good like 2 to 4%. I like that. I think we've called it for the Force for Good fund. We call it like a living return as opposed to concessionary, because it's more like this is what you need. You know, you don't need more than that.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a great way to frame it. And I hadn't heard the metaphor around the forest, and I think that's another great way to pin it down to something that's in nature.
Okay, so does Boston Impact Initiative then provide capital and technical assistance? Because I imagine some of the companies need assistance as well, in addition to capital.
Absolutely. I, again, have tried, because I live in a very resource-dense city. I'm not going to get these numbers exactly right, but it's something like 250 technical assistance providers are here trying to help minority and women-owned businesses, and 150 capital providers. So we're all here. All the resources we need are here, but it's not working, right? We have capital providers sitting on cash, technical providers having empty seats. We have businesses that saying they're not getting help. So something's not working. And so for me, it takes us back once again to that more holistic thinking. When we have this sort of dominant cultural mindset of silos, because we have this reductionist orientation, what happens is a business finds their way to a technical assistance provider. Maybe they take a program, they graduate from the program, and then they're back in the labyrinth of not knowing where to get help. And so part of what we're trying to do is to weave closer ties among the many technical assistance and capital providers here, right? So if you think about a network map with nodes, lots of dots on the map, what we have is like a ton of nodes, but the links between the nodes are weak. And so our work, sometimes we do the technical assistance ourselves. Certainly if it's in our portfolio, we're heavily involved. But we meet lots of businesses where like, we really can't dive in. There's only a few of us on staff. But we know exactly who you should be working with. So an example for me would be a capital continuum where we helped bring Grameen to Boston so that the, home-based worker, undocumented, maybe $1,500 loan size could go to Grameen. And from Grameen, when they're successful and they're getting bigger than Grameen, they get introduced to Axion, which will take them up to $50,000. And Axion introduces them to us, which will take them $50,000 to $250,000. And then we'll take them to either conventional banking or another larger partner for co-investment. And so the idea would be, how do we make sure that we are tying together really closely all the places in the ecosystem that right now are disconnected? Once again, I live in a city where all the knowledge and all the capacity is here, but we're not using it intelligently.
One of the questions I've asked some of the past guests on this podcast is, it seems like one of the challenges we have in the next economy sort of future of business space is we don't actually know in detail what the end result is we're looking for. We say things like, we want to have an economy that benefits everyone, and we want to benefit all life. And yet I've noticed that, what does it actually look like? Like, what does it mean when we can say, okay, this economy is benefiting all life? And it sounds like this might dovetail with Old Oak Dojo, but I'm curious, like, what do you see as, like, imagine it's 100 or 500 years and there is an economy that's benefiting everyone. What does that look like? I'm kind of curious if you've ever had that question posed to you.
Yeah, I have some thoughts about it. I'll tell you should interview Aaron Tanaka, who has a lot to say about that, from the Center for Economic Democracy. For me, it's where I think the Boston Ujima Project is giving me my greatest insight to what could be possible. Let me take a sort of side turn for a minute, which is that a lot of where I learned, or I should say unlearned, the way I understood our economy came from the 8 years that I was in and out of Zimbabwe during its complete systems collapse. And when you have everything collapse there, 89.76 trillion% inflation, the hospitals closed, there's no water system. I mean, total systems collapse. And you see how people self-organize to take care of each other. There's a lot of learning there about how we organize in ways that work with life instead of against it. The reason I go from there and I translate to Ujima is because it's another place-based economic system. That doesn't mean that it's got impermeable boundaries. We need flows to go from our local to our non-local. There's, going to be, let's take coffee. We're all going to keep drinking coffee. So we know that we're not going to have all the resources that we need locally. But if we can start to learn to identify what we create, produce, and consume locally that is democratically controlled in terms of its, what we want and need as a community, how we allocate those resources. And I'm not talking about central government controlled. I'm talking about democratic participation. So it's not the oligarchy of those who have money deciding everything. And that's what I hope we're aiming for, right? And that I actually do trust people to want to steward the places in which they live so that those places are well. I know that may not be a broad-based belief, but I actually think that when we really start to create space for people's self-interest to be expressed, that self-interest is actually deeply interconnected. We are by nature interested in the well-being of others. We are not by nature selfish. We can get into a whole other topic around what human nature really is and the myth that we are competitive, selfish, and separate, when in fact we are hyper-connected, interdependent, and generous by nature. So I trust the democratic process, and I also trust our capacity to learn from past experience around trade and what does it look like for local economies to really become strong and resilient and have healthy relationships outside their boundaries. But I don't know how to envision that at scale. I know how to explore that idea locally, and then I also know how we spread ideas, small local experiments that spread from place to place to place. It's how scale arises. It's an emergent phenomenon. So it's also got to do with how we understand the way change happens.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is how politicians, for example, if you are a supporter of, say, Bernie Sanders or Hillary or even Trump, it's easier sometimes to get excited about a politician if they speak in a way where we don't actually know what we want in the end. And so it's easier to get on board with a politician. Here's a hypothetical, right? So if I believe that an economy that works for all life involves the majority of businesses being worker-owned cooperatives or something, and that's the end result, then it sort of allows me to work backwards to today and say, who are the politicians talking about that? And so I can support them as opposed to just any politician who's talking about the future, the revolution, et cetera. But maybe that's being too specific. I don't know. What do you think about something like that?
Yeah, so this is the good news and the bad news for me. So again, as a systems thinker, and I think it's really hard for us to break ourselves of the habit of finding the next best thing. But if we take the metaphor from agriculture, which we know that a monoculture field of corn or soy is very brittle and extractive. Brittle meaning a disease can come in or the price of oil changes and it's not effective for us, right? Whereas a permaculture field of many, many, many different types of interdependent species and crops is very resilient and adaptive. Same thing for me about our vision of the future. We don't need to figure out what the next best economic system is. We need to figure out what a multiplicity of coexisting economic systems are. And we need to learn to exercise our muscle of discernment to figure out which one is best suited to which. So an example might be maybe the form of capitalism that's best suited to innovation. And maybe the commons, like earth, air, and water, should be centrally planned, right? And maybe something like healthcare should be some sort of socialist approach. But we haven't even engaged in that conversation because I think we argue so much about which so capitalism was proven better than communism. And now what's going to be proven better than capitalism, to me, is the wrong question. That if we could really learn from nature, we'd be like, oh, we need all of these economic systems to coexist. And we need to start experimenting with and learning which economic system is suited to which type of activity, which is the best one, and how do they coexist? Those are the questions I get really excited about.
That's fascinating. I've never heard you could have capitalism, socialism, and sort of a centralized discussion. Are there thought leaders or people or books in that space that you've looked to that are kind of leading in that discussion around what this multiplicity could look like?
So two different ways of thinking about that. One for me is Bernard Latier. He was the one who designed the euro. He's a Belgian economist who is the one that I learned first about the idea of multiple types of capital, right? So like you might have fiat-based interest-bearing capital for this, and currency for this. You might have a time dollar for that. You might have a currency tied to a basket of commodities for this. So that idea that we don't want, if we have a global monoculture of fiat-based interest-bearing currency, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just inadequate as a tool to do the job. So we need multiple currencies. So Bernard has a lot to say about that. And then my mentor, Margaret Wheatley, who I've learned about systems thinking from, is really the one that's helped me understand it's never going to be one right thing. That's not the way nature works. That's the way our sort of human mind developed around the time of the Industrial Revolution, where we started actually around the time of Sir Isaac Newton, when we started to really think in reductionist, siloed, causal, linear ways. And as we move from understanding the world as causal, linear, and predictable, which is the way machines work, to understanding the world as complex, emergent, and unpredictable, which is the way nature works, then I think we'll start to get maybe more comfort with the notion of multiple truths and coexisting realities and coexisting systems and structures, which is what I think we need to have a true breakthrough in resilience for our economic system.
Yeah, I really like this idea. Have you read any of Charles Eisenstein?
Charles is a good friend.
Okay. I was going to say, yeah. You're speaking very much like his book, A More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible.
Sure.
Yeah, I really love that idea of there's multiple systems that can be true at any one time, because I think there is a tendency, even for folks in the next economy space, to be like, what's beyond capitalism? So it sounds like what you're saying is there's a lot more nuance, and there could actually be multiple systems working at the same time.
I mean, people always ask me, do you think worker ownership is the holy grail? And I'm like, God, I love worker ownership, but I have lots of companies that I would say, I wouldn't go worker ownership right now if I were you. It's not the perfect solution for everything. And it's not always the right time if you think about the profile, for example, of workers who really can't afford to have any loss. They're living close to the line. And so there's a lot to explore there. I still think it's like one of the most underutilized tools that we can play with. But the real question for me is, what are the values that we want to place at the center? And then we can structure many different kinds of systems as an expression of those values. But that shift from, extractive, right, or all of the things that we talk about that we're all fighting against, to regenerative, to a solidarity economy, to economic democracy. That's where we can have cohesion, which is the values that are at the core of the economy we wish to create, and then multiple expressions of those values in different forms and structures.
One of the things I think that your work, especially at the Berkana Institute, is most famous for is the two loops model. And I'm wondering how a description of that would work on a podcast if you don't have a visual. Do you think it's possible to describe to listeners what the two loops model is, so folks might get a sense of that? Sure,
yeah. I mean, it's as simple as understanding that sort of all systems rise, peak, and move into decline, right? So you can picture any curve. You didn't have to have the picture in your head, but whether that's a political system or a technical system or an economic system, and at some point, usually around the peak of that system, is when signs of disruption appear. Right. And one way to think of this, we'll use fossil fuel versus renewable energy, which is back in the 70s, at the time we thought the U.S. hit its peak oil. And we saw all these disruptions in pricing and supply and contraction. And at the same time, of course, we saw alternatives start to appear, solar, geothermal, wind. All that happened. There were tax incentives. Jimmy Carter put the solar panels on the White House roof, right? Things were looking good. And then this is the key thing about systems, which is they're all inclined towards self-preservation. They don't want to be threatened. And so Reagan comes along, tax incentives go away, panels go off the White House roof, and renewable energy goes underground for a period of time. If a system is really at its peak, then the alternatives will reappear again and again and again. And so you have something like Iceland where you're at 100% renewable energy, right? So we know that an alternative is possible. And then you have the struggle going on in this country, especially under the Trump administration, where you're seeing what I would consider to be the death throes of a dying system, right? This really uncomfortable, painful, reactionary effort to preserve a system that is actually in collapse. Now, we have to remember this is the long view. It's not going to happen the next 20 or 30 or 50 years. But the long view is that fossil fuel is not going to be our base for energy. Same thing for me. I would call the dominant system that we're in, you might call Wall Street casino capitalism, or the extractive economy, or what David Korten calls the dying suicide economy. And the alternative is what we're talking about here, which is regenerative, which is a solidarity economy. And it's organized around the well-being of people in place rather than being organized around extraction and profit maximization. And we're in the struggle. I actually think the extraordinary time we're in is there's a number of systems that came out of the Industrial Revolution that are past their peak and in decline. And they're all of these beautiful regenerative systems, whether that's the local food movement or the renewable energy movement or the green building movement or the regenerative finance movement, that are nascent and aren't well organized and are experimental and are going to fail a lot before they really gain momentum. And we're living in this time of turbulence as the old hasn't collapsed and is holding on for dear life, and the new hasn't really emerged and gotten robust enough yet for many of us to join it. I mean, it's a pretty wild time to be participating in. And there's no way to know whether we're just going to be in collapse or whether the emergent systems will gain enough momentum and strength and participation to really lead us into a healthy regenerative future.
And what do you think?
I think there's going to be a lot of suffering. I think both. I mean, I guess this is also a time of paradox where we hold two truths simultaneously, that I think it's inevitable that those of us who are working toward a regenerative future will continue to accelerate our learning and find amazing solutions that really work for all life. And I think the forces that are afraid of that and want to preserve the current allocation of power and capital will take pretty extreme measures to do that. And this is a time where that turbulence and that chaos, I think we're going to be seeing it for a long time to come. And I think that it will be disproportionately inflicted on low-income people and people of color. And that's why to me, like, my prayer, please, to the impact investing world is the planet matters. It's urgent, but the people matter just as much, and they're tied together. It's the same shift in economic system because it's about values. And the well-being of people in place is one phrase. And that we've got to start including the economic justice piece along with our ecologically sustainable investing, or the whole thing doesn't work. We have to let go of the old values, and we have to move to the new values wholesale. And so that if we really care about helping to give birth to something different, we actually have to examine in ourselves the parts of us that have benefited from the current dominant system and what we need to let go of deeply inside ourselves. We have to do that work.
You mentioned a few folks earlier, like Margaret Wheatley. I had mentioned Charles Eisenstein. Are there other folks that the listeners could, other books or thought leaders or resources that you recommend people look at for those folks who are interested in learning about this, sort of how to make the shift in values to the next economy?
I think, Charles is a great example. I think that the shift in values is a personal process that has to happen. And I think that we all have really deep work to do. So there's lots you can learn. There's a lot, and I think a lot of the people that you've interviewed for this podcast are great people to learn from for what you can do as a manifestation of those values. But the values work, this is always tricky to say, like, go find a spiritual practice, right? I mean, there's go deep into whatever your practice is to discover, how attached am I still to consuming, right? What is my relationship to the role of my voice and my power? I mean, I was in a meeting recently where it was wonderful to watch the light bulb go off, where an older white man said, hold on a second, maybe I shouldn't take another board seat. Maybe I should give someone else that spot. It's my time to step back. And I have to see what I have to give up by not being able to use my voice for power, right? So there's a lot of deep work that people need to do, whether that is race-based or whether that is just about who am I in the world as the world is shifting from underneath my feet. I don't know anyone who's in this work who hasn't found themselves in some way having to do deep reflective spiritual work, whether that be through meditation or some sort of community, because we are challenging the birthright we were given when we were born about how we were allowed to show up in the world and what's being called for from us today.
Yes. Agreed on the spiritual, especially yoga, meditation. And I guess, as Charles would say, the story of separation versus the story of interbeing, sort of moving from that the old story to the new.
Absolutely.
Is there anything that listeners can do to support your work at either Boston Impact Initiative or Old Oak Dojo or any of the other projects? Like, how can folks support you?
Okay, so a couple things. One is just because I find myself doing this all the time, and say, please, whenever you walk into a room that is homogenous and of dominant culture, do something about that. Say something about it. If it's a panel and it's all white, if it's an event or a board and it's all men, everywhere we go, we need to put economic justice into the conversation. We need to put justice into the conversation and racial equity into the conversation. So one thing is like walking away from this podcast, like look around, it's all over the place, and say, I'm sorry, I won't participate unless you do it differently. So that's one thing that will help me a lot, because I'm finding myself doing that all the time. Second, that we didn't get into this, but we are trying to experiment with really creative covenants in our lending and investing activities that put things like diversity and inclusion in the board and in ownership and in management, that address the compensation ratio and other worker ownership. So if anyone has experience with really creative covenants that put social impact at the center, I would love to hear about it, because we're trying to construct some right now. And then the last thing I'll say is we're opening up our fund to outside investment in 2018 and would love to have people join us in that.
This is the Boston Impact Initiative Fund?
Yes. So actually, I can ask for two. The Boston Impact Initiative Fund will be open next year, and the Boston Ujima Community Capital Fund will be looking for philanthropic loan loss reserve and patient capital, also probably toward the end of this year, early next year.
Fantastic. And I'm assuming you've spoken to, it seems like RSF is always leading in the covenants piece, but I know you probably know those folks.
I had a call with Don last week about it, Don Schaefer last week about it, and he gave me a couple people to talk to about it that I've reached out to. But we'd really like to sort of push our field in getting more demanding with these investments.
Great. So where can folks learn more about your work?
Yep. So it's bostonimpact.com. I can be reached there. And if anybody's in Boston and wants to check out the Old Oak Dojo, they can come by Old Oak Dojo, DOJO.com. And of course, from our either website, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook.
Great. Really appreciate you being on the show, Deborah. It's really inspiring to hear how you're both working within the current system and also on the next system at the same time. I think that's very rare. So just wanted to appreciate you for that.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.